Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're doing something kind of special for you.
Oh.
Usually we pick the topics, but this time it's all about stuff you guys flagged. You sent over a whole bunch of articles on
Yeah.
President Trump and FEMA and disaster relief, all this talk about changing things up. So we figured let's dive right into it,
Absolutely.
see what's going on.
Huge topic right now.
Yeah. I mean, Trump's been, really outspoken saying he wants FEMA to go away. He even called it a disappointment at one point.
Yeah. Pretty strong words.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I wanted to get into. Like, what does that actually mean
Right.
for people like you and me? Like
Yeah.
if a hurricane hits or there's a wildfire or some other crazy disaster, what happens if that federal help isn't there?
Well, I think to understand what getting rid of FEMA would mean, you got to understand like what they actually do now.
Yeah.
A lot of people think they just like swoop in and take over after a disaster, but
Right.
it's more like they're a backup system for the states.
Okay.
So a governor says, hey, we need help.
Mm.
The situation's too big for us to handle locally.
Right.
That's when FEMA steps in.
So it's not about like taking control. It's more like providing backup
Exactly.
when things get really bad.
Yeah, it's supposed to be a partnership.
Okay.
And, this push to get rid of FEMA, it seems to be coming from this thing called Project 2025.
Oh, yeah. I saw that in one of the
It's
articles.
basically like a blueprint from some conservative Republicans on how to like shrink the federal government. And two names you might want to look into, Ken Cuccinelli and Russell Vought.
Okay.
They're like the big proponents of this whole shift.
Okay, so less federal government, more responsibility on the states.
Right.
But can all states handle that?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some states deal with disasters all the time,
Right.
but others not so much.
That's a key point. You got states like Florida, Texas, California.
Yeah.
They've got these sophisticated systems for dealing with hurricanes, floods, wildfires.
They've kind of had to...
Right. They had to because it happens all the time.
Yeah.
But a lot of other states, they just don't have that level of experience
Right.
or resources.
So what happens to those states if they suddenly have to handle a major disaster on their own?
Yeah, that seems like a problem.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads into this idea of block grants,
Okay.
which is another big piece of this project 2025.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of FEMA providing money as needed after a disaster,
Right.
states would get like a lump sum beforehand.
So like a disaster allowance.
Yeah, basically like, here's your money, state, spend it wisely.
Interesting.
Now, the folks who like block grants, they say it gives states more control,
Okay.
and could maybe speed up the process of getting funds where they're needed.
Makes sense in theory.
Right.
But I'm guessing there's a downside too.
There is, yeah.
Like what happens if a disaster costs way more than the state's block grant?
Mm-hmm.
Who pays the extra bill?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, literally.
Yeah.
If costs exceed the block, grant the states on the hook for the overruns.
Wow.
And for states with limited budgets, that could be devastating.
Yeah.
It's basically shifting the risk
Right.
from the federal government to the states.
So let's say your state gets hit by a major hurricane
Mm-hmm.
and the damage is way more than they anticipated.
Right.
Suddenly they're scrambling to find the money to rebuild
Yeah,
and there's no FEMA to back them up.
exactly.
Pretty scary thought, isn't it?
It definitely raises some concerns.
Yeah.
Yeah, even Lynn Budd,
Who's that?
she represents state emergency management directors.
Okay.
Even she called the idea intriguing,
Intriguing.
but admitted there could be serious problems.
Well, while we're talking about states handling disasters, there's
Mhm.
something happening right now in California that I think highlights this whole thing
Okay.
perfectly.
Yeah.
Trump's out there touring wildfire damage
Yeah.
and meeting with Governor Newsom,
Right. Right.
which is interesting because they've had a very contentious relationship the past.
Very contentious.
Yeah. But now they're all smiles and handshakes, putting on this show of cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
Newsom even went to greet Trump at the airport,
Really?
even though he wasn't on the official list.
Huh.
What do you make of that?
I mean,
Is this a genuine change of heart, or is there something else going on?
I think it's safe to say there's some political strategy at play here.
Yeah.
Remember, Trump wants California to make concessions on some key policies?
Like what?
Like voter ID and water usage.
Right.
And Newsom desperately needs that federal disaster aid.
Yeah.
So they both have something to gain.
From this sudden display of friendship.
Right, exactly.
Speaking of things Trump wants,
Yeah.
I noticed during his visit he kept talking about getting residents back on their fire-damaged properties ASAP.
Mm-hmm.
He even talked about waiving permits to speed things up. Sounds good on the surface, right? Get people back in their homes quickly.
It does, but there's a big question about safety here. The article mentions Trump downplaying concerns about hazardous waste in the debris, even saying, what's hazardous waste?
wow.
And this isn't the first time he's downplayed environmental risks.
Right.
His history with asbestos is pretty concerning.
So imagine you're a homeowner who just lost everything in a wildfire.
Yeah.
Would you feel comfortable going back to your property
Right.
without knowing for sure what's in that debris?
Yeah.
What if there's asbestos or other dangerous chemicals?
That's a tough call.
And it brings up another point. What if you can't afford to clean up or rebuild quickly?
Right.
If FEMA isn't there as a safety net,
Yeah.
what happens to those folks?
And it's important to remember that even with FEMA,
Yeah,
recovery can be a long and difficult process.
right. The article highlights some folks in North Carolina who are still struggling to recover from Hurricane Helene, which hit back in September.
Wow. So that's 4 months of people dealing with damaged homes, insurance battles,
Right.
and the emotional toll of losing everything.
And if, as President Trump stated, FEMA was a disappointment, even with their involvement,
Right.
it does make you wonder what happens when that support system is weakened or removed entirely.
Absolutely. And this idea that states should just take care of it themselves
Yeah.
ignores the fact that federal assistance is often the difference between a community rebuilding and being left behind.
Wow.
And it's not just about money either. It's about expertise coordination,
Right.
having a system in place to handle the complexities of a major disaster.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah, we have.
We've looked at what FEMA does, why Trump wants to get rid of it, the potential impact on states and individuals.
Absolutely.
But there's another piece of this puzzle we need to explore. What about international aid?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. You're right. It's not just about, shifting disaster response to the states. This is part of a bigger thing.
Right.
This whole shrinking the federal government's role in lots of different areas.
Like international aid.
Exactly like international aid.
And that's where this whole thing about Trump banning aid to organizations that even mention abortion comes in.
Right.
Like, how does that fit into all of this?
Well, it's a perfect example of how disaster relief gets all tangled up in politics.
Yeah.
Trump's always been very vocal against abortion.
Mm-hmm.
So this policy is basically an extension of that stance.
So even if, like, most of what they do is help people after earthquakes or floods,
Right.
if they so much as, like, mention abortion,
Yeah.
no money from the U.S.
Very much.
seems a bit extreme.
A lot of people think so.
Yeah.
The critics, they argue that it's counterproductive
Yeah.
and harmful, especially when it comes to international aid.
Yeah.
We're talking about groups that might be providing healthcare, clean water disaster relief, and family planning services
Right.
all in one package.
Yeah.
So cutting them off completely could really hurt the people who need those services the most.
It's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, you're trying to stop one thing,
Yeah.
but you end up hurting a lot of other important efforts.
It seems like a lot of humanitarian groups and global health experts are saying the same thing.
They are, yeah. They're saying this policy is short-sighted and ultimately harms the most vulnerable people.
Especially women and girls in
Mhm.
developing countries
Right, exactly.
who might rely on these organizations for essential services.
Yeah, we've been talking about what might happen here in the U.S. if FEMA goes away.
Right.
But this international aspect adds a whole other layer.
Yeah. It makes you wonder if disaster relief becomes more and more tied to politics,
Mm-hmm.
both here and abroad.
Yeah.
What happens to those most in need?
It raises a lot of tough questions.
It does.
Like, will we see a future where countries only help those who align with their political views?
Right.
What happens to the people who don't fit into those neat little boxes?
Yeah. It's pretty unsettling.
It really is. And it brings us back to something you said earlier.
What's that?
Knowledge is power.
Oh, yeah.
The more we understand these issues, the better equipped we are to have a say in what happens.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another aspect of disaster relief that often gets overlooked.
What's that?
The mental health impact.
Ah, yes, the unseen wounds.
Right. We tend to focus on the physical damage,
Hmm.
the houses and buildings that need to be rebuilt.
Yeah,
But what about the emotional toll?
exactly. People who've lived through hurricanes, floods, wildfires, they can experience a whole range of mental health challenges.
I can imagine.
PTSD, anxiety, depression, even suicidal thoughts.
Wow.
And it's not just the individuals who are directly affected.
Right.
Their families, their friends, their whole community can feel the ripple effects.
So it's like a hidden epidemic that follows every disaster.
It really is.
And makes you wonder if FEMA is gone
Right.
and states are struggling to handle the immediate physical needs,
Yeah.
will there be any resources left to deal with the mental health crisis?
That's a very real concern.
Yeah.
And even if FEMA isn't eliminated entirely, any reduction in its capacity could have a significant impact on the availability of mental health services.
For disaster survivors.
Exactly.
So what can we do about this?
Yeah.
How can we make sure people get the support they need, both physically and emotionally, after a disaster, especially if the system is changing?
Well, I think the first step is awareness.
Okay.
We need to recognize that mental health is just as important as physical health,
Yeah.
especially in the aftermath of a disaster.
Right.
And we need to advocate for policies and resources that prioritize both.
So it's about speaking up,
Yeah.
making our voices heard, and demanding that our leaders take this issue seriously.
Exactly. We can contact our elected officials,
Right.
support organizations that are doing good work in this area, and make sure that mental health is part of the conversation.
When we talk about disaster relief,
Right, because at the end of the day, it's about people.
it is.
It's about ensuring that everyone who's been through a disaster gets the help they need to rebuild their lives.
Physically and emotionally.
Absolutely. We can't just focus on bricks and mortar.
Right.
We need to take care of the human side of disaster recovery as well.
Yeah.
And that means recognizing the trauma, providing support, and creating a culture where people feel comfortable seeking help when they need it.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in all the numbers and the rebuilding and the policy stuff.
Right.
But you got to remember the people at the center of it all, right?
Absolutely. The human impact is what matters most.
We've talked about, the potential for more stress on states
Yeah.
if FEMA's role is reduced. But, what does that actually mean for folks on the ground?
Well, think about it. If states are already stretched thin,
Right.
trying to just handle the immediate stuff after a disaster,
Yeah.
things like mental health support, they might not be the top priority.
It's like triage.
Right.
You got to deal with the most urgent physical needs first.
Exactly.
But then the emotional needs kind of get forgotten.
And those wounds, they can really fester if they're not addressed. We're talking about anxiety, depression, sleeplessness, flashbacks, all that stuff that makes it hard to function,
Right.
hard to rebuild your life.
And it affects everyone around you too, right?
Absolutely. It ripples outward,
Yeah.
impacts families, jobs, whole communities.
So what can we do?
Well,
Let's say you're listening to this and you've been through a disaster or you know someone who has. Where do you even start?
first of all, know that you're not alone.
Okay.
It's normal to feel overwhelmed, scared, even angry after something like this happens.
Yeah.
Don't bottle it up.
Right.
Talk to someone you trust, a friend, family member, a therapist. There's no shame in asking for help.
And if you don't know where to turn, there are resources.
Absolutely.
The Red Cross, FEMA, for now at least,
Right.
mental health hotlines. There are people out there who want to help.
And remember, even small acts of kindness can make a difference.
Like what?
Just listening to someone offering a helping hand, showing that you care.
Yeah.
Those things can go a long way.
It's like that saying, we can't help everyone, but everyone can help someone.
Exactly. And I think that's a good takeaway for everyone listening.
Yeah.
This whole debate about FEMA disaster relief, international aid, it can feel pretty overwhelming,
You can.
even hopeless at times.
Yeah.
But we're not powerless.
Right.
We can learn about these issues. We can speak up for change. We can support each other.
It starts with recognizing that this isn't just about politics. It's about people's lives.
Absolutely.
It's about making sure everyone has what they need to survive and rebuild no matter what's thrown at them.
Well said.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We hope this has given you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to get involved.
Right on.
Remember, your voice matters and your actions can make a difference.
Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.
Take care, everybody.